Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Center's launch of the Net Zero Business Alliance. I am Jason May, and I have the opportunity to talk a little bit about the ambitions of this effort, and then we'll get into our conversation. For those of you familiar with our work and the structural challenges facing the country, you will know that our main theme of the moment is the fierce urgency of pragmatism. And that is really the spirit with which we bring to this new exercise. I think the goal of this effort, first and foremost, is to accurately frame the magnitude of the carbon and methane reductions that are going to be necessary to achieve a sustainable climate, to acknowledge the vast scale of that challenge, and to work with leaders in a number of the nation's most significant sectors to talk about what they can do, not only with their own companies, but with their entire coalitions to really move forward on this very challenging agenda. I think that the climate debate for the last many years has been kind of caricatured between corporate and conservative interests who have questioned the necessity and the possibility of decarbonization, and climate advocates and others who have basically said it's just a question of will, it's basically pretty easy. And I think our view is that neither of those are responsible solutions. I think if there was one sentence to define what we are really interested in discussing, it's the fact that achieving net zero emissions is absolutely necessary, urgent, and really hard. And it is the acknowledgement that the amount of work we have to do, both in the public and private sector, is unlike almost any challenge that our nation has ever faced before. We recognize that there's not a lot of trust in this system. And I think the companies who we are working with get the fact that it's time for show me, not tell me. We also think it's pretty important for the climate advocates to take yes for an answer. The scale of this challenge is a profound logistical issue. And the folks who we know who have the capacity to make those kinds of economy-wide changes in the extremely narrow time frame that is available are the companies and many others who we are working with. So just a couple of the kind of key ideas that are anchoring this discussion, and then we will start the conversation. The first is net zero emissions by mid-century, and a focus on the word net as much as the word zero. While all of the companies in our organization and this panel do not have exactly the same imagination about their company's roles or exactly what is going to be the pathway forward, everyone recognizes the scientific imperative for net zero. I think the second important point you're going to hear a lot about is scale. The scale of this challenge is profound and dramatically underappreciated by many in this debate. I think we are here to acknowledge that solving climate change is going to place a tremendous burden on shareholders, on customers, and ultimately on taxpayers. And if all of those folks who are really kind of part of the enterprise are not on board, we're pretty concerned it's going to be tough to get there in time. I think the last couple of things to mention, we believe very strongly that it's an all hands on deck moment. We don't think it is possible to have cultural preferences for the approach to decarbonization. I think if you look at any of the scientific evidence, we need every single non-carbon electron or part of the power system that we can possibly find. So we want to talk about that issue. Our government is not prepared for success. We do not believe that our nation's current permitting processes are adequate to achieve a fundamental change in the economy in the next 20 or 30 years. And so those are really tough issues we've got to work on. We believe strongly in the imperative for carbon removal, and that's one of the issues that we think has been kind of underattended to, but how you get that, last 10%, again, we think is going to be absolutely required to have new technologies and also significant focus on some natural solutions. And then last and not least, this is going to be a dramatic transition for industries, communities, and individuals. And while no one questions the importance of the challenge, and I think few question that over time, America will be a more competitive economy, and we will provide tremendous amounts of good, high-paying new jobs. it's equally true that a lot of people are going to be hurt in this transition. And our view is that we're going to have to take that issue head on with a different scale, but also a different tone, if we are going to meaningfully create the kind of national consensus that is necessary to solve big problems. So that is the spirit of the Net Zero Business Alliance. I would now like to talk with the founding members of this exercise, and they are Tom Fanning, who is the CEO of Southern Company, Scott Kirby, who is the CEO of United Airlines, John Tyson, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer at Chisons, and Russell Hagen, who is the Chief Financial Officer at Weyerhaeuser. The fifth founding member is Vicki Hollub, who is the CEO of Occidental. Some of you may be aware that Texas is having a reasonably significant challenge right now with the supply of electricity. It is affecting both Vicki's significant corporate operations as well as her home internet. So she could not be with us here today. So with that drum roll, I want to ask each of our panelists a question, recognizing that hopefully you'll say a little bit about your company and why you have chosen to put time into this exercise. And I'm going to start, Tom, with you, because power is at the front of the line. I think that the ambition of the Biden administration is to decarbonize the entire economy by 2050, but the electric power sector is supposed to lead the way and get there by 2035. And so I want your reflections on whether you think that is an appropriate goal, and is it doable?
Yeah, sure, it's doable. And Jason, let me say at the outset, I've worked with Jason in the Bipartisan Policy Center for years. In fact, I think one of your offshoots is the Energy Innovation Council. I'm on that with Bill Gates and others. And I think it's so important right now as a nation that we adopt this idea of coming together. I think not only is the public thirsting it, I think Congress is, and a variety of other people. So now's the time to act. The other thing I just want to say is, we're all used to these team forums and showing up in, collared shirts and sweaters and all this, and I'm wearing my goofy tie today. After I finish this forum, I'm going over to the White House. I also lead our industry, or help lead it, on things like cyber and physical security. And so I'm working in the national security realm to think about reimagining the partnership between the private sector and government in protecting our American way of life. In so many ways, I think that applies to this conversation. And that is, when we think about the big challenge of removing carbon from the American way of life, or our consuming nature, that we must reimagine, I think, what our obligations are, how we can work with government to join arms with them to accomplish this big task. I think back to the idea of the kind of missionary zeal we had when we approached the first landing on the moon. These issues are that important. And so as we consider the policy options going forward, particularly in energy, as we transition the generating fleet, as we rethink how to move power around the United States, as we rethink how to consider different transportation fuel alternatives, as we rethink how to consume energy and energy efficiency options. These are things that I think we have to do hand in glove with government. There's a very exciting opportunity to get that done right now.
So the government is excited about the idea that you're going to decarbonize all of your facilities in the next 13 years.
Well, here's the thing. We've already made a commitment to get to net zero, and you're right to stress the net part of that, because the last X% of that curve could be really expensive. And so maybe the better idea is not to try and change everything to zero, maybe 5 to 10% to zero, but rather go through new technology approaches to remove carbon from the atmosphere directly. And in fact, we have the largest, by far in our industry, proprietary, robust research and development facility. And we're undertaking efforts to do that right there in Alabama. And Southern Company is a big deal. You mentioned a little bit about our companies. We're a little bit smaller, but from an energy production standpoint, we're about the size of the nation of Australia, and a little bit smaller, but that's the kind of scale that I think we can represent in thinking about the national argument. These are big deals. We can certainly beat 2050 net zero. We can go faster than that. But there are important policy choices. I've already sent a letter to President Biden expressing my desire to work in partnership with the government to achieve that important objective. And I'll just say this one last thing. I have my earnings call tomorrow. And so everybody should tune in and listen. It'll be riveting stuff. But the truth is, we set an intermediate goal to achieve 50% reductions by 2030. Tomorrow, I'll be able to announce, I guess I'm announcing it now, that we have achieved that 2030 goal in 2020. So without a forcing mechanism, we beat it by 10 years. Now, 2020 was an unusual year. We get that. But here's the important point. The entrepreneurial spirit of America, combined with the public policy need to accomplish big things, can make, I think, an opportunity to achieve these kinds of results in a comprehensive way. And I think we're going to have to do this not in the silo of energy, but in working with my brothers and sisters here in broader industry to achieve the national objective.
Well, Tom, that is an exceptional setup for a question to Scott Kirby. Tom talked a little bit about the last 5 or 10% he thinks that the power sector might need. Batteries are really heavy.
Yeah.
You have made some really bold announcements about what United can do within its own operations. And so help us understand how you're thinking about that.
Yeah, well, thanks for hosting this, and I'll piggyback on a lot of what Tom said. I'd start by saying I do think we're at a unique moment in time where there's an increasingly high percentage of people on both sides of the political aisle that are ready to solve this problem. And the fact that we have a group here today that includes an airline, a utility, and while Vicky can't join us, an oil company, people that are really focused on the real solutions is what it's going to take to get these problems solved. But an important part of that is, I think, to be honest about the difficulty and to be honest about the fact that we can't solve it just by getting rid of carbon. And you talked about aircraft and batteries as an example. And as great as electric vehicles are going to ultimately be allowing us to decarbonize the grid, the reality is batteries are never going to have or at least nothing that's even on the theoretical drawing board, are never going to have the energy density to fly long-haul aircraft with a lot of people on board. Even hydrogen, which has higher energy density, requires 3 times the weight as jet fuel to fly. And so there's nothing that's even on the drawing board. And aircraft aren't the only ones that fit into that category. Tom talked about the 5 to 10%. There are going to be parts of the economy where we are still emitting carbon. But the answer is, I think, and Tom said the same thing, is getting to a world where we get to net zero. But I think it's important that we stop talking about net zero the way we have historically, which is the traditional net zero programs, are about, I know Weyerhaeuser's on, but they're good projects, but they're about planting trees mostly. And the reality is we emit 4,000 times the amount of carbon emissions that we did in the pre-industrial era. We cannot plant 4,000 times as many trees. And at least for me, it's literally impossible to make the math add up unless you get to a world where you're doing direct air capture and sequestration. Tom talked about it. If Vicky was on, we're partnered with Occidental on it. They're the leaders. They're the one doing all the engineering. We're just along for the ride at Occidental. But we're going to have to get to direct air capture and sequestration, or this problem is simply not going to be solvable, I don't think.
Hey, Scott. So Russell, Scott's calling you out, my friend. And as everybody, I hope, appreciates, right? The premise of this exercise is not to get 6 or 8 people together who already agree about everything, right? So I think we're really wanting to work through the questions about how mechanical carbon reduction and natural solutions interact, how one makes them verifiable, permanent. Russell, I think, intrigued by the fact that as the CFO, you have been brought into focus on this issue, which argues that you see this as a significant part of the actual core business. So how would you like to talk about the scale of what you think natural solutions can provide?
Jason, I think, it's a very complex question. I think, Scott and Tom have raised these issues too. Natural climate solutions aren't going to be the only solution. At Weyerhaeuser, yes, we grow trees. We're stewards of millions of acres across North America, 11 million acres in the United States, and then 14 million acres up in Canada. And so clearly we are thinking about this in the context of how we manage our resource to contribute to the net zero solutions. And so we do need to combine all solutions, though, to the table really to achieve this. It's an enormous problem. And so just coming to the table with only natural climate solutions is one of the opportunities, but then also we do need to continue to invest in technology for carbon capture, and also continue to work on emission reductions. And so the scale of the opportunity is large, but the scale of the problem is also large. And I think, coming together as a group on this forum, where we have airlines and energy and, Tyson Foods and Weyerhaeuser together to seek a common solution, I think is a very powerful start in really trying to achieve a net zero solution.
So, John, I think Russell opened up the complexity of the challenge. Not that it's not incredibly hard for Tom and Scott, but they have tailpipes to deal with. Some very large. Tyson's is a really complex enterprise, right? I think you are on kind of both sides of the equation. You're going to be emitting and potentially part of the natural solutions reduction. So just share a little bit about how you were thinking about the climate challenge, and maybe the fact that agriculture has been really one of the hardest issues, I think, to get our arms around.
Well, yeah, thanks, Jason. And thanks to the Bipartisan Policy Center. I'm proud to be a part of this group representing Tyson. And the fact that we've got leaders from so many different industries here to come together and talk about things, agree and disagree in places, as you said earlier, I think is a testament to the seriousness of getting this group of business leaders together. But before I talk about the question you asked, maybe for those that are not familiar, Tyson, let me tell a little about Tyson. We're one of the largest food companies in the world and a global leader in protein. We started out as a chicken company in the 1930s, and we've since grown to have a big portfolio of consumer packaged products with brands that people on this call might know, like Jimmy Dean, Hillshire Farm, Ballpark, and Adele's. And of course, we're also one of the biggest beef and pork producers in the world. Tom, you gave earlier some context and scale was easy to understand, which I appreciated. If you think about Tyson, roughly 1 in 5 protein servings consumed in the US comes from our business. So if we can figure out some solutions to the problems we're talking about, we feel like the impact is real, and we want to be a leader in that space. Why are we here, though? We're here because we recognize there are challenges and complexity to addressing emissions in the agricultural supply chain. We've been serious about it for a while. In 2017, we set out to establish a science-based target initiative, approved 30% reduction goal by 2030. I'm jealous, Tom, that you guys have achieved your goal so much further ahead of your initial date, but we're working hard and fast toward meeting our goal as well. I think if I could just lay out some data points that talk about what the challenges are that we see in the agriculture business and protein and food production, is that there are a lot of small independent producers growing food and raising livestock that have to be a part of the solution. For example, we do business with nearly 10,000 independent farmers and ranchers around the country, and we're committed to doing business with those producers who are committed to raising food in a sustainable and transparent way. What I can tell you is, farmers are raising animals using less feed and water than they were 50 years ago, but that doesn't mean that we still don't have a long way to go in terms of creating a sustainable food system. One thing I will say, and we talked a little bit about natural climate solutions, we're trying to figure out what the role agriculture can play in the net part of net zero. We know, for example, that practices like planting cover crops are beneficial to soil health and soil erosion. And there's a lot of attention around the potential for farming practices to sequester carbon in agricultural soil. And we're trying to figure out what the longevity of those types of solutions are. But what I do know, and what I'll wrap up by saying, Jason, is a couple of things. One, American farmers and ranchers are some of the most resilient people in the world. And many of those that we do business with have been on the same plot of land for 50 years or almost a century. And the other thing I know is that American industry, I think as we've seen time and time again, I'm a small student of history, has risen to the challenges that it is faced with and come together to solve those problems. And so I think this conversation today is just one step of many positive steps toward America, business leaders and a lot of the public sector leaders in Washington and around the country that are listening here, coming together to solve the problem of reducing emissions and getting to net zero 2050.
Thank you,
Hey,
Tom.
Jason,
Yes, Tom.
I was just listening to these guys and they're terrific. Two thoughts occur to me. Us joining together and having this conversation is terrific, but we are going to need, I think, a reimagined partnership with the government in order to accomplish this great big objective. The other, I think, important element is reducing carbon is a critical issue. But don't we have to also take that issue in context with energy justice or economic justice, or making sure that we have clean, yes, safe, reliable systems and affordable? All of these things have to be balanced together. So I think we can create this moonshot-like fervor to accomplish the big issue, but we need to do it differently. It's not enough to sit in the Business Roundtable or the United States Chamber of Commerce or even this forum. We need to get the government involved to help us really be successful here.
Tom, let's talk about this, like de-risking and speeding stuff up, right? So yeah, we've known each other for a long time. I've never heard anybody describe you as laid back. You have taken on some pretty big efforts, right? I think Vogtle will be the largest new non-carbon source of energy in the country by maybe an order of magnitude. It's been tough. There's been some government support, but I think what we've always known is the first mover process when you get to these billion-dollar stair steps are much harder than they're supposed to be. If everybody had to go through the process that you just went through in building Vogtle, I don't think there's any chance that we'd hit 2050. So talk a little bit about what it took to get that going and where the government could be more helpful if we wanted to speed that process up by a factor of 3x.
Yeah, listen, man, that's a great issue. People should know that there's a lot written about Plant Vogtle. For example, the schedule delays and the cost overruns, and it's multi-billion dollars. What we have first started with is a way to protect Georgia Power's customers. And, we're going to bring that plant online, hopefully November this year, November next year, 2 different units, at a price to customers that's less than originally forecasted. Now, how can that possibly be? We had one of the major vendors go bankrupt, Westinghouse. We had the parent of Westinghouse give us $3.7 billion in a guarantee. We wrote off $1 billion ourselves. And so, Jason, you're right. If you had advanced knowledge of those kinds of issues, who in their right mind would ever go forward? And that's where I'm thinking that if we want to preserve nuclear as part of this national solution, so I'm working with Bill Gates on some of those ideas, in order to prove the pilot plant for the Gen 4 reactors that are not capable of melting down, et cetera, the R&D investment at an early stage is in the hundreds of millions of dollars. As we think about an infrastructure bill, as we think about an imperative for the United States to remain the center of technology advancement, then I think this is a natural partnership where the government can come in with industry to help prove some of these ideas so that the transition to net zero is friendlier to all people of different economic strata, that it occurs faster and more efficiently. And then we have to deal with the other issues of resilience. See Texas right now, anyway. I'm sorry for those people at that extraordinary storm. They're living under extreme duress right now. And so what can we do to avoid that? And what can we do to make sure that, for 3 years I was chair of the Atlanta Fed, and 1 year I was chair of what they call the conference of chairs at the Big Fed, the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States. What can we do to make sure that the burden of advancement is fairly shared among all American citizens? These are important policy decisions where the private sector must come together with the federal government.
Awesome. So I will just reiterate that, I think Southern's been probably the most courageous investor in non-carbon technology. And one of the real reasons we're happy to have you here is because you know how tough it was. And so I think we really want to learn from those experiences. And that turns me again to Scott on the question of scale. So, you've made the point that you're going hard into carbon reduction technology and going to be counting on that for millions metric tons of carbon reduction. Right now, we've got some really cool demo projects. And, I think Oxy would probably say it's more than a demo project. What can we do? Can we get those things up and running at not just the first gen, but the nth plants in time to make this work? And what do we need to do to increase the likelihood of success?
Yeah. So if you just look at sequestration, look, all of these are about having honest conversations. Tom's point about nuclear, which I applaud Southern for pursuing nuclear, because we're not going to solve the grid and have reliable power without it, unless something new comes along. And the same is true on sequestration. And I think of sequestration much like where we were with wind or solar 20 to 30 years ago. And we were 20 to 30 years ago, people were talking about wind and solar can never be economic. And today they are. In many parts of the country, they're more cost effective than traditional power generation. But they weren't at the beginning. And it demonstrates that you can come down dramatically down this exponential cost curve. And I hope the same, and I believe the same can happen with sequestration. And Becky, I'm certain, would say the same thing. And that's really why we're involved. It's not economic today, but it ultimately can become economic and drive down that cost curve. But the government had a really important role to play at the beginning, in the birthing stage of making solar and wind viable and economic, and providing credits and support and incentives. And the same is going to be true for sequestration. And ultimately, for sequestration to be viable, is probably going to require some kind of price on carbon scheme, because unlike wind and solar, there's really there's not a lot of reasons to sequester carbon, economic reasons, other than to reduce carbon in the atmosphere. And so the government's going to have to be a critical partner. And if the government's willing to do that, it can do the same thing. The same thing can happen. The same kind of revolution in technology can drive the cost down. It can really be a huge, not the only part of the solution, but a huge part of the solution. And to me, it's the only way we're really ever going to get to what we call, true net zero.
Do you think our democracy can handle the amount of failure that will be necessary to have the breakthrough in time?
I certainly hope so. Others have already said it, but I have huge faith in the American system and the democracy. It's the best. It's clunky and not perfect, but the best system that's ever been developed on the face of the planet, I think, and I'm really proud of it. And Tom, I think, was the one that earlier said this is like our go to the moon. I think the same is true, and I've said that often in my conversations in DC. Everything didn't work when we were trying to go to the moon. We had failures along the way, but we ultimately got there. And the amount of spin-off, that's what I don't think people really appreciate. The amount of spin-off technology and advances in society. If we hadn't have gone to the moon, would we have GPS today? I don't know. I mean, it'd been hard for a private company to support the first, space launches if you weren't, doing it for a government reason. And all the technology that we just take for granted today that came out of that. And the same thing will happen if we get the government behind pushing us towards zero carbon solutions. That I think will be really good for the economy. To Tom's point, it'll be disruptive to the economy, and there will be people that are harmed. And so the government policy should support those people and give them a path, because we can't say, well, it's not good for the economy, but millions of you lose your jobs and you're harmed. And so we should make it fair. But it is an opportunity to really do more than just advance the carbon economy, but to advance new technologies across the board that'll benefit us in ways none of us have even thought about yet.
I have an observation and a hard question for John and Russell. I think the observation is that the nation was united in shared purpose during the space program, which I think allowed us to weather some really horrific accidents. That has never been the case yet around climate. And so I think one of the ambitions for this project is to help kind of grow that sense of shared urgency and purpose. And part of that is, uniting the country around this mission. And my question, Russell, for you and John, rural America is feeling left behind already in a lot of different ways. And, I think if you look at any of the polling, there's not as much sense of urgency around climate change in rural America as there are in the kind of big metropolitan areas. You both have major operations in rural communities, and I think, Tom, you serve a lot of rural communities as well. But how do you think about, what kind of response have you gotten when you make these kinds of public statements? How do your workers think about it? How do your suppliers think about it? What needs to happen to kind of ingrain the full supply chain in the solution?
And Jason, I think that's a really good point. And I appreciate that we're going to have technologies emerge to address these issues at the scale that's necessary. But when you look at, working forests, and, Weyerhaeuser is a commercial timberlands owner, but you also have, thousands and thousands of what we call non-industrial private forest landowners. And those are primarily in rural communities. That's where our operations are at. That's where our timberlands are at, and that's where our manufacturing is at. And this, technology, carbon capture technology, is already in existence in a lot of our trees, and this is the lowest cost. It's not going to be the entirety of this solution, but it's a really important component of the solution. And a working forest and the manufacturing associated with that produces wood products that store carbon for years. And so it's a really effective natural system to capture and store carbon. The other piece is working forests provide a lot of biodiversity, jobs, clean air, clean water, and that's really important also to these rural communities. The job creation in the rural communities has been lagging, and we all know this. And our industry is focused on making sure that we maintain working forests and keep them as working forests. Because if you don't have the incentives, if you don't have the wood products, if you don't have the opportunity maybe to capture carbon or be paid for capturing carbon over time, the challenge is those working forests will be taken into other uses, and that may be net carbon. So I think part of the policy also has to recognize and appreciate the value of working forests and wood products, not only in the carbon capture and storage, but also in the economic development in these rural communities.
So, John, I think one of the points of high ridicule around the Green New Deal was the idea that we were going to be trying to put emissions control on animals. Again, I think a bit of a caricature, but how is this idea of net zero that everybody on this process has kind of committed to as the national goal? How does that resonate with your people, employees, suppliers, neighbors?
Yeah, it's a complicated question with a complicated answer. But I can say a couple of things that I know for certain. One, we believe that all of our employees, all of our producer partners are excited to work with Tyson because they have a partner who is interested in their longevity and success and is trying to be part of the future solution for a climate positive world. And we don't want to get in the business of some of the finger pointing that I think we see in the public discourse around the impact of agriculture on climate emissions. I think to your comment about, what should we put emissions regulations on livestock? I think what we say and believe is that there's no one silver bullet for climate change. That's why we have people from different industries on this call today. We believe we have to have sustainable livestock production, and we also have to have alternative proteins to feed the world. Both of these things are true. And, you can't not focus on one at the expense of the other and vice versa. We have to do both. And so I think what we're most focused on is making sure that we're going to be advocates for our producer partners and help them be a part of the solution rather than leaving them behind. That nobody wins in that scenario. And if I could even bridge it to what we were talking about earlier with kind of social justice, economic justice around energy and accessibility. I think we saw some numbers during the last 12 months where, as many as 1 in 10 Americans are food insecure. And we also know that nearly 30% of food produced in the US goes to waste. So I think, I want to focus on making sure that we have a sustainable supply chain, but there are also some tweaks that we can make in terms of how we, route and move food around the country without increasing the cost of production in other parts of the business.
Hey, Jason, I think this is an important question. So if I could, I'll add on something, which is, I think it's important if we're going to solve this as a society, we have to stop, my view, stop letting the extremes on either side drive the conversation. For far too long, we let people that denied that climate change was real drive the conversation. We tried to create data and prove to people that it's real and we should do something about it. We're decades behind because we did that. And that's a very small minority, I think, that's left of serious people that deny that climate change is real. But on the other side, we also can't demonize every industry or company or individual that emits carbon. Because the reality is, as John said, we all need to eat. We all do need power. We all are going to fly or to travel and to do things. And we need to find solutions. And if we start by demonizing groups, we put them on the defensive. And it's harder for them to be a part of the solution. And we need to start talking about solutions and stop letting the extremes on either side, I think, drive too much of the conversation when 80% of us want to solve this, want to find real ways to solve this that don't blow up the economy overnight, that allow us to continue to have power to our homes, that allow us to continue to eat what we want to eat, but really, really want to solve it. And that's the group of people that needs to work together to solve it.
And the other thing I would add is that the knock-on effects of this are really important. We all are great community citizens. I think business broadly gets tagged with all they care about is the bottom line. One of the things we're fond of saying is that we're bigger than our bottom line, and we really must be great citizens wherever we're privileged to serve. And so therefore, when we think about the dislocations that naturally occur as we go through this transition in America and around the world, we really do need to take into account what happens to the employees that get dislocated, what happens to the communities that are impacted. Look, before I became chairman of Southern, I think we produced 70% of our energy from coal, round numbers. This year, we'll report that's down to about 17%. We have shut down a number of our coal facilities, and it's very clear that coal, essentially generation anyway, has a short half-life in America. What do we do about those facilities? Because a decent-sized coal plant in Georgia, for example, employs about 500 people. Those people earn about double the wages that are available elsewhere in their generally rural communities. And when you shut down that plant, what happens to the tax base? I know in one instance, that plant represented 40% of the tax base of that community. And what do you say to the teachers and the police officers and the firemen and the other public servants that are impacted by all these changes? In my view, so far, we have not had a layoff of a person that has been dislocated from a coal plant. If we are able to effectively plan over time, we can retrain and reposition people in our companies that will minimize the amount of dislocation that naturally has to occur. And in terms of making sure that the community welfare is spoken for, all of our companies have foundations, all of our companies work together to assure that maybe we can repurpose these facilities. Maybe we can take the acreage around a coal plant and turn it into a solar farm, for heaven's sake. There's a lot of different things, including economic development, where we must think very broadly as industries in order to make sure that the communities are as well off as they can be. And I'll finish with this comment. Those of us that have been on the Business Roundtable and really across America have been faced with the idea that this ESG component of our value premise has become more important today than ever. And I think this S component, the sustainability, really does speak to these issues. And so I would say this: American industry has always been for the American public broadly. And as we attack this important objective, we're going to have to keep that in mind as we make the transition as efficient as we can.
So I got a couple more questions. I really kind of want to reflect on a few things that have been said. Then we have questions popping here on my other screen. It's a little bit like flying a helicopter. I think, Tom, you talked about the broader economic issues. And I think, one of the ideas that I really credit the Green New Deal with was imagining the process beyond the energy system, understanding it's kind of a full economy conversation. And while I believe some of the particular ideas were unserious, that was I think, pretty important breakthrough. And so I guess I want to, ask any of you, as you think about this transition, do you think the solution is trading energy jobs for green jobs, or is that part of a solution that has to include healthcare and workforce training and broadband? And are we thinking about the transition issue too narrowly, I guess, is my leading question.
Well, that was part of the point I was trying to make. We must think about it broadly. And when I talk about economic development, we have partnerships with the state and with each of the communities, the counties around the states we serve. And this has to be the broadest possible perspective in how we address the dislocation issues that occur in a transition.
All right, so I'm gonna turn to some questions, and I have a few more at the end if we have time. I think I'm gonna kind of collapse a few of these into themes. I think one theme that's coming in loud and clear, and I put this initially, I guess, to Russell and Scott and John. We're gonna leave Tom out of this one. The measurement issue, right? A few different questions say, look, we get it. Natural solutions got to be part of the fundamental outcome, but how do you measure these activities in a way that is commensurate with the rest of the reduction strategies? And I see Scott grinning, so I know he's going to have a little bit of a rebuttal. And I know, John and Russell, you don't think that this is easy, and that's part of the reason why we're doing this project, but you're thinking about it. So, Russell, how are you thinking about the verifiability and permanence and all of those multi-syllabic ideas?
Yeah, I think it has been a challenge. What I would say is we've seen this market, what we call the compliance market, emerge over a number of years, and a lot of it has been in some developing countries. There has been questions as to, do we really gain the benefit of permanence over a long period of time relative to the value of the carbon offset? And so as investors, or buyers are coming in to purchase these, they want to make sure that what they're buying is of value, and that it's credible, and that they get the benefit of that over the period of time that the contract sets. And so, for instance, in the California program, it's 100 years to lock up for carbon that's stored in standing timber. In some of the voluntary markets, which are just starting to emerge and getting much more popular and forming, it's around 40 years. And so that's a long period of time to make a commitment. And, at Weyerhaeuser, we're thinking about this quite a lot. We're a 120-year-old company. Very skilled, very experienced in all these types of timber operations and manufacturing operations. And so as we think about how we're going to engage in this, we feel that if we are to engage in it, we have to bring forward kind of a high standard so that our brand and our credibility stands behind whatever carbon credits that we may bring to market. And I think over time that the market will have to emerge, because again, as the demand continues to increase, and we're seeing a tremendous amount of demand form, we're going to have to make sure that we can demonstrate, not only as Weyerhaeuser, but as a industry, if we're going to store carbon within timber and forest lands, that carbon is permanent for the time that contract is established. And that's going to take more technologies from the standpoint of monitoring that carbon growth and sequestration over a long period of time. And so even though the natural climate solutions like storage in timber and storage in wood products is readily available and has a meaningful contribution to the overall net zero challenge, we still need to evolve additional technologies to ensure that we can demonstrate to Tom and the rest that that carbon credit is of value over that period of time. So again, it is an evolving market. What I am encouraged to see, though, is the amount of demand and the amount of effort that the tech companies, oil and gas companies, energy companies, transportation companies are bringing to the table, because I do think the conversation is moving from the margins, as was earlier stated, to the mainstream. And once it comes to the mainstream, you're going to have to address all of the issues. At least the issues are being discussed, for instance, in this forum. And I think that's a tremendous step forward to starting to figure out how do we come together and provide solutions.
Jason, if I may jump in on that same question, two things that we think are really critical as it comes to measurement and reporting in the world. The first is transparency and information will drive accountability. And you talked about taxpayers and shareholders coming together, the ultimate bearers of kind of the costs and benefits of these kinds of investments. And consumers also need that information so they can make choices about who they're doing business with. And so we believe that information and high quality information allows the American public to partner with and support those players in the game that are, trying to do the right thing. I think the other thing, to build on what Russell's talking about, is, would connect to what Russell's talking about. We think science has to lead the way, and we believe that's especially true in the world of carbon credits and carbon markets that are starting to proliferate. Demand far outstrips the supply of high quality credits. And the risk there that we believe is, if we are to spend, say we are able to band folks together and put a lot of investment into, things that will help sequester carbon, but we're not yet sure of the science, well, we have the risk of wasting 10 or 50 or hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars with the public sector supporting that. And so I think there's an element of going slow to go fast that we have to tolerate in order to have the greatest impact down the line.
Awesome. So Scott, question specific to you from Argus Media. And the question basically is interested in hearing about how United Airlines is planning on achieving the net zero 2050 target, based on what you acknowledged about the internal operations, and how much is it going to focus on also the airport and kind of service side, in addition to the craft themselves.
So we've coined a new term called 100% green instead of net zero. We're all using net zero today. But we've coined a new term, 100% green. And the reason is because this whole point about carbon offsets. And for our 100% green, we're not counting traditional carbon offsets, the kinds of things that mostly get talked about. We're only counting it if it's a real reduction in emissions, or any emissions that come out of the tailpipes or anywhere, we're putting back in through sequestration. That's how we get to 100% green. Look, I think the important part of this conversation is, John talked about transparency. I challenge anyone to go off and look at some of these entities that provide carbon offsets to companies to find out what their projects are. It is almost impossible. And as somebody who's been a CEO trying to purchase them and asking them, it is almost impossible. The reason it's almost impossible is because those are businesses. And the businesses succeed by selling more carbon offsets and getting more people to create carbon offsets. And so a lot of them, there's a lot of great things that are happening. I know Weyerhaeuser is doing great things that are real. And others are doing things that are real, but a lot of them are simply not real. And even if they are, the bigger point is they are not scalable to get to the world where we can solve 4,000 times as many emissions. They simply cannot scale anywhere close to that level. And the reason I react so strongly to the traditional carbon offsets is it's just an easy siren song. I've talked to enough CEOs who just want to check the box, write a check to a group once a year, and I did my part on carbon. And we're not going to solve the problem. It can be a part of the solution. It's not that it shouldn't be a part of the solution, but it is the solution for the vast majority of companies that say they're going to get to net zero. It is writing a check to go plant trees. And there's nothing wrong with doing that, but it is simply not scalable to ultimately solve the problem. So at United, when we say it, we know we're going to still be emitting carbon into the atmosphere. And when we say 100% green, we really mean every molecule of carbon dioxide that comes out the back is a molecule that gets sequestered underground.
All right, so I got a tough question. I'm going to put Tom on the spot, and it's come from a few different sources. And it feels a little bit off, Scott, what you just said, which is, we have a lot of these now very kind of bespoke commitments to net zero 2050, feels kind of far away. And Tom, I would summarize the questions as like, how do we trust you guys? Right? Like, there's a general sense that, look, every company on the call, every company in America at some point in the last 30 years was not on board a net zero solution. So, I said earlier, it's time to take yes for an answer. Make the case.
Hey, Jason, let me pick up one thing too. I will get to that, but John said something that was really important. Science got to lead the way. Private sector and government can lead the way with energy innovation and innovation in order to deal with carbon, whether it's storage technologies or hydrogen or new nuclear or energy efficiency. The idea of investing in research and development and innovation is to take ideas that are currently out of the money and make them in the money. And so joining together in that important effort is something that I think will give us a great pathway to success. And we intend to be a leader in that. Now, with respect to this idea about how can you trust us to get there, I'll use our own example. We've already committed. We were one of the first ones out of the gate in our industry to say, I guess our first comment was low to no by 2050. And then we committed to, so the difference between low and no was kind of 80% removal to 100% removal. And we said that delta will be accomplished with energy innovation and technology and other things, including net zero, the direct removal. And in fact, we're demonstrating direct removal of carbon from the atmosphere at our research facilities now. So it's not just a bio problem. We're doing all these things with no forcing mechanism. Oh, by the way, we accomplished our 2030 objective in 2020 with no forcing mechanism. We don't have a clean energy standard. We don't have a renewable portfolio standard. We don't have a carbon tax. And yet we've concluded in this balanced approach of clean, safe, reliable, affordable, we can in fact get there, and it is worthy for our customers and our communities to get there in a balanced way, and we've done it. So now the logical question is, what's next? What are the policy choices we're going to have to move to get away from net zero 2050 to net zero 2035, or you tell me what the number is? And we should have a very healthy discussion of what the kind of policy choices along the way are. We can have forcing mechanisms that will regulate or tax or whatever our way to kind of coming in compliance. But I think, Jason, great things in America are not done out of a sense of compliance, but a sense of aspiration. And I think this issue is one where the nation, the private sector, must aspire to, and therefore reach beyond a rule or regulation to get there. I think we demonstrated over and over and over again. So we could put a set of rules in place and people can verify and we'll be all fine. But that's not going to get us to where we need to be.
So let me put the question to the rest of you. I think this is really kind of a crucible. Clearly, there's going to have to be private sector aspiration leading the way. But you've all also said the first 50% is tough. The next 50%, that last 20% is really tough. And it's out of the money. So if you have a solution which does not make economic sense for your shareholders, doesn't it demand some kind of government obligation to get us where we're going? I mean, Scott, you said the words carbon tax, so you clearly see a post-technology, method to kind of deploy more quickly. How do you all think about the role of government from a kind of requirement, mandatory side, in addition to a inspired investment side?
Well, look, I think it's a fair criticism. Are companies saying this, or are they going to really? How can we trust you? Your original question to Tom. But also, what I would say is action speaks louder than words. You listen to because the truth is, for a lot of companies, it is just words. But for a lot of companies, it's not, and for an increasing number, it's not. You look at what Southern Companies has done. With sticking to it at Vogtle, which I applaud you for doing, despite all the travails and difficulties. Or at United, we've invested in several sustainable fuel companies and sequestration and electric aircraft. It'll be a short haul electric aircraft, but electric aircraft. And actions do speak louder than words. But getting all the way there, I do think, there's going to be a lot that happens because it's just the right thing to do. And from a shareholder perspective, I also believe that while we're spending more money right now on sustainable fuels than if we just bought traditional jet fuel, it is costing us more in the short term. For our shareholders in the long term, it's the right answer and it's a better answer. But because by doing the right thing early, we can help create the right kinds of solutions in the long term. And so from a shareholder perspective, I feel really good about it, that it's good for the shareholders in the long term.
Well, and Scott, you complimented Tom for sticking with Vogel, and I think your continued commitment to this, recognizing what the industry has been through for the last couple of years, I think is also a real demonstration that
Thank you.
You guys are in it.
Jason, if I could, I think I echo what Scott said about look to those companies that are walking the walk in addition to talking the talk. That's critical. But you also asked the question, I think, do we need support from the government? And I think the answer to that question, what I'll say is we have a chance of being successful sooner if there is public and private partnership in pursuing this innovation pipeline. And I think that's something that's important to recognize, because ultimately, while you have taxpayers funding it up front, they're reaping all of the benefit on the back end. And I think it's a really the downside situation potentially, and not addressing climate change is significant. And so that's the mindset that we need to have in dealing with these challenges.
And Jason, I'll just add kind of one final comment. Shareholders are obviously a really important part of everything we do. And Tom, good luck on your call tomorrow. Mine was last week. But the other thing that we're seeing is just the emergence of a lot of different stakeholders. For instance, a lot of our employees, particularly the next generations that are coming in and starting to work at these companies, are demanding a response. They're demanding that we address and start, moving towards solutions to this climate issue. And we're also seeing a lot on the ESG front, as far as portfolio managers, et cetera, investors, they're demanding a response. And so, John, to your comment about transparency, it's really going to be critical that we as companies come forward and have a transparent view into the actions that we're taking to address not only our shareholders, but the broader stakeholder group to begin really driving towards a net zero solution.
So I want to just take a moment to, of course, thank you all, and particularly your staff who do all the work. But your interest in joining in this, frankly, I think different kind of narrative, this, yes and, as opposed to, yes but, I think is what's really going to help us turn the corner. For those several hundred online, just to give you a sense of next steps, we've identified what we think the big challenges are, and now we're getting to work on it, right? So when Scott and John and Russell have consensus about measuring offsets, we will have a contribution to make to the debate. When we can think with the administration about how to streamline a permitting process so that the imagination of a $2 trillion clean infrastructure investment is actually going to get put into the ground in the time frame that matters, that's something that we're going to be working on and sharing with everybody. As we think about technology inclusive policies that are going to make sure that we get every single carbon solution into the mix, again, that's something that we're going to be working on and sharing. And so I think you are going to be hearing from this group quite a bit, and we will have, I think, several other companies we're talking to probably joining us quite shortly. And just this is an invitation to let us know how you think this exercise and the BPC can be helpful, because I will end where I started. Fierce urgency of pragmatism. We cannot spend another decade having a kind of dumb debate about bad science and bad math. And so we are trying to take that next step together, and we appreciate everybody joining us. So have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Jason.
Everybody.
Thank you, Jason.